What if the moment a financial metric becomes important, it actually becomes less reliable? This idea helps explain why economic indicators, performance statistics, and policy targets sometimes stop reflecting reality. It's called Goodhart's Law. The idea was first discussed by the British economist Charles Goodhart in the 1970s while studying monetary policy. He observed that once policymakers begin targeting a specific economic indicator, the statistical relationship that indicator had with the broader economy can change or even break down. In simple terms, when a measure becomes a target, it can stop being a good measure. Why does this happen? Because people respond to incentives. When a number determines rewards, policy decisions, or financial outcomes, people begin adjusting their behavior to improve that number. Not necessarily to improve the underlying system, but to improve the metric itself. You can think of it like measuring the performance of a company. If a company is evaluated purely by quarterly profits, managers may start focusing only on short-term results. Even if that hurts the company in the long run, the number improves, but the underlying system does not. Economic history contains several examples of this pattern. One well-known example comes from the fight against inflation in the United States in the late 1970s and early 1980s. At the time, economists and policymakers used different measures of the money supply, known as monetary aggregates. Two commonly discussed ones were M1 and M2. M1 is a narrow measure of money. It includes physical cash and money held in checking accounts. In other words, money that can be spent immediately. M2 is a broader measure. It includes everything in M1, but also savings accounts and certain other deposits that are slightly less liquid. During this period, many economists believed that inflation was closely related to how quickly the money supply was growing. Because of this idea, the Federal Reserve began placing greater emphasis on the growth of certain monetary aggregates, especially M1, as an indicator when conducting monetary policy. The reasoning was straightforward. If the growth of M1 slowed, the amount of money immediately available for spending would grow more slowly, and inflationary pressure might eventually decline. But once M1 became an important policy focus, financial markets began to adapt. Banks and investors were responding to economic incentives, not trying to manipulate the statistics themselves. They were mainly trying to offer competitive returns and respond to regulatory limits on interest rates during a period of high inflation. Financial institutions began developing new financial products that allowed people to hold cash-like assets without keeping their money in checking accounts that were counted in M1. One important example was the rapid growth of money market funds in the early 1980s. Money market funds allowed investors to hold highly liquid, short-term financial assets that behaved in many ways like cash. However, these funds were not included in M1 because they were not traditional checking deposits. As a result, people could move money out of checking accounts, which were counted in M1, and into money market funds or similar instruments that were treated differently in the money supply statistics. From the perspective of the statistics, M1 could appear to grow slowly or even decline, but in reality, people still held large amounts of highly liquid money-like assets. So, policymakers were still watching the growth of M1, but financial innovation had made M1 a much less reliable indicator of the liquidity in the economy. In other words, the metric policymakers were focusing on no longer reflected the underlying reality they were trying to understand. This is exactly the type of situation Goodhart's Law describes. Once a metric becomes a target, people begin adjusting their behavior in ways that make that metric less useful for measuring what is actually happening in the system. And sometimes these incentive effects can lead to very unexpected outcomes. In fact, there is a famous historical case where a government tried to reduce the number of dangerous cobras and accidentally ended up creating more of them. Economists call this the cobra effect, and we'll look at that story in the next video.